What drives a human being to kill? Not out of survival, not in war, but coldly, deliberately, as if morality never existed. Could it be madness? Evil? Or is there something even darker, something buried deep within the psyche of ordinary people? This video will not give you simple answers. It will unravel the chilling truth: every killer starts as someone you might have passed on the street. We're diving into the abyss, guided by one of the greatest psychological architects of human suffering, Fyodor Dostoyevsky. From Crime and Punishment to his own near-death experience, Dostoyevsky understood something most psychologists overlook: the line between good and evil runs not between people, but within each of us. If you're drawn to the hidden dimensions of the human mind, subscribe now, because what you're about to hear is disturbing, profound, and unforgettable. In Crime and Punishment, Dostoyevsky presents us with Rodion Raskolnikov, a destitute but intellectually gifted student in St. Petersburg who commits a brutal double murder, not out of financial desperation or emotional rage, but to validate a theory he's crafted in isolation. He believes that certain individuals, those he deems extraordinary, have the moral right to transgress laws that bind the rest of humanity. In his mind, men like Napoleon achieved greatness precisely because they didn't allow themselves to be hindered by conventional morality. Raskolnikov's inner monologue reveals a chilling descent from abstract philosophy to visceral violence, from ideas scribbled in notebooks to the blood of two women soaking a floor. Dostoyevsky doesn't portray the killer as a mindless brute but as a man who kills because he thinks too much and feels too little. His crime is born not of impulse, but of ideology, a dispassionate intellectual experiment gone horrifically real. Dostoyevsky's vision of the killer walks a path eerily close to Friedrich Nietzsche's concept of the Übermensch, the overman who creates his own values and lives beyond traditional notions of good and evil. But while Nietzsche provocatively explored this idea as a form of radical personal freedom, Dostoyevsky framed it as a dangerous illusion. He wasn't applauding Raskolnikov's ideology, he was dismantling it. For Dostoyevsky, the belief that one is above conscience is not a sign of strength but of spiritual decay. Once someone convinces themselves that they are exceptional enough to escape moral consequences, every action can be rationalized, even the most grotesque. The terrifying truth he unveils is that such beliefs don't require public acclaim or political power to grow. All they need is a closed room, a fevered mind, and the silence of isolation. Carl Jung offers another lens through which to understand the mind of a killer. He proposed that each of us carries a shadow, the darker, repressed side of our personality that includes all we deny, reject, or cannot face within ourselves. The shadow isn't evil by nature, but it becomes dangerous when ignored or disowned. If we refuse to acknowledge and integrate it into our conscious self, it festers and begins to act autonomously. For Jung, the killer is often someone whose shadow has grown too large to contain. It bleeds into consciousness, distorting perception and severing empathy. Instead of remorse, there's logic. Instead of guilt, there's justification. Jung warned, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. In the case of a killer, that fate is often horrific, not just for the victim, but for the perpetrator, who becomes a puppet of their own disowned darkness. Hannah Arendt, in her reporting on the trial of Adolf Eichmann, a key architect of the Holocaust, coined the unsettling term the banality of evil. Eichmann was not a raving madman or sadistic monster, he was calm, composed, and disturbingly ordinary. He followed orders, filled out forms, and spoke of logistics, not morality. For Arendt, the most horrifying aspect of evil is not when it appears as something demonic, but when it wears a bland face, speaks bureaucratic language, and blends in with the crowd. Evil, in this view, often arises not from passionate hatred but from a failure to think deeply about one's actions. The psychology of a killer, then, is not always marked by dramatic pathology, it can be terrifyingly unremarkable. It may emerge in environments that reward obedience and discourage conscience. The Stanford Prison Experiment, conducted in 1971 by psychologist Philip Zimbardo, is one of the most famous demonstrations of how ordinary people can commit extraordinary acts of cruelty under the right conditions. College students, randomly assigned the roles of guards and prisoners in a simulated jail, quickly spiraled into abusive behavior. Within days, guards were humiliating, dehumanizing, and psychologically tormenting their peers. These were not violent individuals. They had no criminal pasts, no histories of cruelty. What they did have was power, anonymity, and a context that normalized domination. Zimbardo concluded that under certain environmental pressures, circumstance can overpower character. The potential for cruelty lives in all of us, not as a fixed trait, but as a latent possibility, waiting to be activated. The killer, in this sense, may not be born but made, by the right mix of fear, control, and ideological license. Dostoyevsky himself was no stranger to existential despair. He stood before a firing squad, facing what he believed were his final moments, before being reprieved at the last second. That brush with death haunted his writing. Many of his characters wander through a moral wasteland where God seems silent and meaning has evaporated. In such a vacuum, people grasp at power, violence, or ideology to fill the void. The absence of a higher moral anchor doesn't lead to freedom, it leads to collapse. Raskolnikov's descent is not just a psychological unraveling, but a spiritual one. He is not merely sick, he is hollow. The weight of nothingness becomes unbearable, and in trying to assert himself through murder, he ends up proving only his own disintegration. Take Richard III of England, a historical figure whose ambition led him to commit unspeakable acts, including the likely murder of his own young nephews. Shakespeare immortalized him as a villain of gleeful cunning, but behind the literary drama lies a psychological truth. Richard was driven by ruthless ambition, yes, but also by a belief that power justified any crime. From a modern psychological perspective, he displayed traits of Machiavellianism, manipulation, strategic thinking, and a disdain for morality when it obstructs goals. His story echoes Raskolnikov's idea that the ends justify the means, that greatness excuses violence. Whether in a 15th century palace or a 19th century garret, the logic is the same: if the goal is high enough, no act is too low. In modern forensic psychology, many serial killers exhibit patterns of pathological narcissism. They don't see people as fellow humans but as objects, tools for gratification or obstacles to be removed. Ted Bundy, for example, was educated, articulate, even charismatic. But behind the facade was a chilling void. He could mimic charm but felt nothing. He was detached from human feeling in a way that went beyond apathy, it was predatory. In Dostoyevskian terms, Bundy was what happens when ego eclipses empathy, when self becomes so inflated that others vanish entirely from moral consideration. He wasn't an anomaly so much as an extreme example of a very old truth: when conscience is silenced, intelligence alone is not a safeguard, it becomes a weapon. Karl Marx wrote of alienation, the sense that under capitalism, people become estranged from their labor, their community, and themselves. Dostoyevsky sensed this alienation too, though he framed it more spiritually than economically. His characters often drift through life untethered, spiritually numb, cut off from any sense of purpose or belonging. This alienation becomes fertile ground for violence. A mass shooter, a terrorist, or an ideological killer is often someone who feels deeply disconnected, isolated not just socially but existentially. They lash out in search of meaning, identity, or revenge against a world they believe has forgotten them. Alienation doesn't excuse violence, but it helps explain why some seek redemption or significance through destruction. Before someone kills, they tell themselves a story. It's rarely random. The narrative might be one of grievance, righteousness, or fatalism: I had no choice. They deserved it. It was for a higher cause. This is called cognitive reframing, a psychological defense mechanism that allows individuals to justify actions that would otherwise cause moral conflict. It transforms atrocity into necessity, cruelty into justice. In Dostoyevsky's world, guilt doesn't always break the mind, it is often circumvented entirely. The human psyche builds walls to protect itself from the full horror of its own actions. What's left behind is not a tormented soul, but a rationalizing one. Sigmund Freud posited the existence of the thanatos, the death drive. While the pleasure principle seeks life and fulfillment, the death drive pulls toward ruin, self-destruction, and the dissolution of identity. This theory helps explain why some killers don't just harm others, they unravel themselves in the process. Some leave behind manifestos, orchestrate standoffs, or even commit suicide after their crimes. They aren't always driven by hatred for others, often they are consumed by a desire for oblivion. In Dostoyevsky's universe, this is not foreign. His characters teeter on the brink of annihilation, not just physical, but spiritual. The killer doesn't simply reject society, they reject existence itself. Not all killers kill for pleasure. Some kill in cold neutrality. This is crucial. A sadist enjoys the suffering. But a detached killer, they view it as a necessity, or worse, a mundane task. This is where Dostoyevsky's genius shines. He portrayed both the emotional killer and the indifferent one, and warned that indifference may be even more dangerous. Many forensic studies trace violent behavior to unresolved childhood trauma, abuse, neglect, humiliation. Dostoyevsky, who wrote from deep personal pain, knew that suffering in youth can twist into rage. But he also knew it wasn't an excuse. Pain can either deepen empathy or erase it. Albert Camus described the absurd man, one who realizes life has no inherent meaning and yet continues. But the absurd killer takes a darker turn. Faced with meaningless existence, he creates meaning through violence. In The Stranger, Massault kills without reason. It is not hatred. It is absurdity. Despite the darkness, Dostoyevsky believed in the soul's capacity for redemption. Raskolnikov, after spiraling into madness, eventually breaks down and confesses. In prison, he begins to awaken to love. Dostoyevsky's killers are not beyond hope, but they must face the full weight of their guilt. And not all do. In 19th-century France, Alfred Dreyfus, a Jewish officer, was wrongly convicted of treason. The public hatred wasn't just institutional, it was psychological. Groupthink, anti-Semitism, and fear turned society into a near-murderous mob. Sometimes, the killer isn't a person. It's a collective. Here's the hardest truth: Dostoyevsky didn't write about killers to entertain us. He wrote about them because he saw them inside himself, and inside all of us. Under the right circumstances, with enough fear, rage, or delusion, anyone can step over the line. The psychology of a killer isn't about them. It's about us. So what protects us from becoming monsters? Empathy. Self-awareness. Spiritual grounding. As Dostoyevsky warned, the mystery of human existence lies not in just staying alive, but in finding something to live for. If we lose that, if we lose love, purpose, humility, we open the door to the shadow. This is the Beyond the Surface channel. Subscribe if you want to keep exploring these uncomfortable truths, and remember, the darkest parts of the human mind are the ones we refuse to look at. Thank you for watching.